Hi, welcome back to another episode of Real-World Serverless, a podcast where I speak with real-world practitioners and get their stories from the trenches. Today, I'm joined by Paul from Stop Forum Spam. Hi, welcome to the show.
Great, thanks for having me.
So, Paul, you've got some really interesting stories to tell about the Cloudflare workers. But before we get into that, can you tell the audience about your work with Stop Forum Spam, what it is, and what you guys are doing?
Sure. The project started as a learning to code experience about 14 years ago now. And it started off as providing a very simple API to a dozen forums, so they could pull the information about email addresses and IP addresses that had been spamming their forums, so that the information shared could then be used by other forums to block registrations. And it slowly grew from 5,000 requests a day to its current request rate of about 350 requests a second over that period of 14 years. And there's been some fairly serious architectural changes along the way as was needed, necessity. We just couldn't handle the load coming through. At the moment, we have 300,000 clients, and they're all welcome to crowd share their spammers that are hitting them, and for the benefit of the entire infrastructure and the clients. It's been getting very busy, and as we've moved through each engineering phase, we've come to the stage now where we've migrated the entire lot from running in VPS servers throughout Europe and America to now running entirely on the Cloudflare workers serverless framework. I've been really excited to see that pick up and go, and without any issue as well.
Okay, very cool. So, can you maybe tell us about how the architecture looked like before? You had the servers running in the US regions as well as in the European regions. What other things do you have in terms of database, in terms of load balancers, and so on?
Sure. If we go back a couple of years to its previous iteration, which had been running for about 5 years before the migration, there had been one server with the main server in Europe, and that was running Percona SQL, MySQL 5.6 for several years, fronted by a load balancer, really just for fault tolerance, to a couple of Nginx servers running PHP, all hand-coded PHP, no framework at all, because at the time we started writing it, there wasn't much in the way of a framework that I was happy with anyway, so it was just pure PHP. Data was initially coming out of MySQL. However, as the requests started increasing and more people started using it, SQL just couldn't handle the load. So we pushed it into a caching layer with Memcache, and eventually that couldn't handle the load, and then pushed it into Redis. And at that point, we're quite happy with Redis because it allowed us to bring up a couple more VPS nodes in Europe and the US, and then use the internal Redis replication in order to push the API data around in real time. With some work on Redis, we were able to get the memory usage down from its initial 800 megabytes of usage down to 160, 180 megabytes per node. Which brought the VPS cost down quite a lot, so we could run an API node on a $5 Lin node, which was really quite handy. It's a free service, we're not funded by anyone, it's all just out of my own pocket. So keeping the cost down was, very beneficial to me as well. So we used a custom version of Redis, which added a couple of commands for doing IP space searches, and that's how it ran for about 5 years. And then the infrastructure started to creak around the edges, and I had a couple of servers fall over. I put the whole lot behind Cloudflare after being hammered with denial of service attacks. Used Cheery from what is now a GoDaddy service to do geographic load balancing, and that really kept the system very stable for quite a while. But there was a lot of hopping between networks, and I was just not quite happy with it. So when Cloudflare announced serverless, I thought, well, this seems like a good platform. It runs on the network edge, it runs close to your server, and with clients hitting the server quite frequently, latency is a real issue. So if I can keep the latency down then I'm not going to be impacting users. If stock forum spam went down, I could see hundreds of thousands of sites having issues, and I really don't want that to happen. So I plowed ahead and ported the PHP code that was running the API to JavaScript and started tinkering around with learning JavaScript and learning serverless, the way that it worked, the issues with it, the pros and cons, and then moved into the data migration. There was issues with data sharding. How's the best strategy for moving data between where it is on MySQL to where it is in the primary key store in Cloudflare, and came to a nice balance of trying to keep the traffic down between the nodes and the data store while still keeping the latencies right down. And after a couple of months of tinkering around with the code, I was quite happy enough to give a guy I know a look at it. He came up with some comments, and we worked on some code revisions and then deployed. No one was the wiser. There was no reports of issues or API inconsistencies. I was really quite happy, and it's been running very well.
That's actually a really interesting story of migration from using more traditional serverful implementations to now entirely running on edge-based workers with a key value store. But for the listeners who are not familiar with how Cloudflare workers work and how the key value store works, can you maybe just give us a quick explanation for what that looks like in terms of the architecture, but also how do you write the code and deploy them?
Sure. The Cloudflare serverless will deploy your code to run on the edge network on any of the Cloudflare point of presences. And there's coming on 170, I believe. So if you have a server in Los Angeles and you request an API query, it's going to be served from a Los Angeles server. Same for Singapore and Singapore, Auckland and New Zealand. They keep it locally. However, the data store is not. The data store is in the US. So if something isn't cached in the local data center, the worker has to request it from the main server in the US. That could add latency if you're requesting a lot of data, which is why I spent such a long time on trying to shard the data in such a way that your small request to a data center in Auckland isn't going to result in 2 or 3 megabytes of data being hauled down from Los Angeles. At the moment, it's kept it down to about 2 kilobytes, which with compression is a single packet. So with the Argo tunnel between the sites, if data isn't cached, then it's pulled from Los Angeles and then cached. And I'm also doing process caching and trying to keep everything in the data center as long as I can before it's expunged and the next request comes through and has to go back to Los Angeles. Unfortunately, you can't really see anything in the Cloudflare metrics to see which amount of data is actually being kept locally, in process, in data center, or then being pulled from Cloudflare in the US. So it really was just trial and error. Pull a large shard with lots of data. What was the latency? Reduce the shard size, but increase the amount of shards stored in KV, and come to this nice metric of, this works well and isn't going to be a manageability issue. If I'd just done one primary key per record, there would be millions sitting in KV. Then you end up with an issue with being unable to populate KV because the Cloudflare API only allows you to set 10,000 keys in a request, and a 50 megabyte request limit. It would take 4 or 5 weeks to process that many keys. So there is a nice balance there at the moment, and I'm quite happy with it. For deploys, this is where Cloudflare Actions comes into effect. MySQL pushes all the data it needs to on a cron basis to JSON, which triggers a Cloudflare worker, which validates the request and then pushes it into GitHub. And then GitHub runs an action which pushes the JSON into the code base and deploys the API with an updated JSON, which includes the global identifiers like the whitelists, the deny lists for domains and IP addresses and ranges that aren't dynamically updated in the API. And as with every anti-spam service, data that's an hour out of date is stale data. The data is refreshed every 10 seconds into KV just to make sure that the moment a bad email address is listed, that it's available as quickly as possible to the customers, or to the clients anyway. So the GitHub workers, the GitHub Actions have really been invaluable in pushing static data out hourly to Cloudflare workers. And so it just triggers an action, GitHub compiles the application, and then deploys it using the Cloudflare API. It's really very quite seamless and very easy to have done. I'm not a developer. Well, I don't do it professionally, so this is a bit of a pet project as well. So it was all learning, but it was just done so easily. It really was.
Okay, and do you have any idea in terms of how quickly those Cloudflare workers running in all of those different edge locations get updated once you deploy an update to them?
The KVs, if you make an update to KV, it's non-atomic, which is what I also had to work around in the code. That takes about 10 to 20 seconds from the moment it hits MySQL to the moment it's available in the KV store. The code itself takes about a minute to compile from the moment the action gets the trigger to the moment it's deployed, and then it's available within each of the data centers within about 10 to 15 seconds, from what I can tell timing-wise in testing. It doesn't take too long.
Okay, that's pretty good. That's really good compared to some of the other alternatives. Within AWS, for example, you have Lambda Edge, and that takes a good few minutes when updates are reflected in all the different edge locations. Another question I've got about the Cloudflare workers is that you mentioned that you're doing a lot of caching in process. So I guess that implies that the process that's running your worker code is long-lived. Do you have any idea in terms of how long that process runs on for?
I've spent a long time trying to figure that one out down to the millisecond. However, as you hit a load balance interface, you hit an endpoint within Cloudflare, it could go to any of the servers in the data center. The best I can tell is that some of the processes running under load last minutes before they're refreshed. The data centers that aren't running that much in the way of API code requests, like here in New Zealand, it was some of the data centers maybe in North Africa, they will last about 30 seconds before the process is expunged. So keeping everything in process, I can keep the request down to KV to quite a lot.
Okay. And what about in terms of the size of the code for the worker? Is there any limit on how big or how long your code can run for?
Yes, there is. And I hit that in trying to reduce KV lookup. So I thought I'd be smart and put a Bloom filter in place before going to KV to get data. However, that pushed the request above 50 milliseconds, which is the current execution limit on the tier that I have in Cloudflare. Now, there is a higher tier in the enterprise, and there is a lower tier on the free service that Cloudflare provide. But I was getting issues with code executing over or not dying after 50 milliseconds of CPU time, not real time CPU time. So eventually I had to pull the Bloom filters out of the code, and with a little bit more in-process caching, at the moment I'm sort of running the 99.9th percentile request at 17 milliseconds, which I'm quite happy with. 99th percentile being about 4 milliseconds. So with the current Cloudflare workers, you have to be very wary of the CPU limits that you do have at your tier. Cloudflare have announced the beta of their new Cloudflare Workers Unbound, which has a different costing model being based on per millisecond of execution. So you can run longer running code on that platform, but I've not put my code in to look at it. I'd be very interested though. That way I might be able to reduce some of the KV queries and being able to expand on the next version of the API, which I'm currently working on at the moment, which I'm also excited to have native in workers, and it'll be coded for workers. It won't be a port of 13 years of nightmare that I've been sneaking in there and wishing I hadn't.
Yeah, I did remember reading that announcement post, I guess a few weeks ago now, when they first announced the Workers Unbound.
Yeah.
It does look really cool. Still though, 99.9 percentile at the 17 milliseconds, that's pretty good going.
And it's going to come down as well when as Cloudflare have merged or integrated the SNI SSL certificate negotiation with the worker startup process. Previously, you'd go through the whole TLS negotiation process and then your worker would be spun up. Now they're spinning the workers up as a part of the TLS negotiation process. So that was great because that reduced latency quite a bit.
Okay, that's good to know. Is that something that's out already, or are they still working on that?
No, that's something, I believe that's out now.
Okay, very cool. And one thing I did have in mind as you were talking about your architecture and how request flows through your system is how do you go about debugging things? How do you go about, the tracing problems and checking your logs?
Yeah. Initially, it started with using the debug functionality in the Cloudflare editor, in the workers editor, web debug, and the good old console.log. It wasn't until the Cloudflare Wrangler came along that you could spin up local development environments, which would allow you to provide a little bit more in the way of node debugging. I'm not a proficient node coder, but I did get into the node debugging in order to look at some things that were really starting to get on my nerves. But for the best part of it, I hate to say it, but console.log actually goes quite a way.
So do all the logs that you print out with console.log get centralized into one place in the Cloudflare workers, I guess, management console already for you?
No, they just go to dev null. So I have very little in the way of debug logs. If the process throws an exception, then I get an HTTP push through to a log collector, which I can see. I get a stack dump and a copy of the URI parameters so that I can then backtrace it. But so far, other than people running pen testing, vulnerability scanning on the API, which triggers pages and pages of logs, I'm not seeing anything in the way of errors coming through from the API. There's the occasional exception thrown from the Cloudflare storage engine, but they're very infrequent and impossible to replicate.
Okay, cool. So I think that's everything I wanted to ask about Cloudflare Workers, but you mentioned that you've got a new project you're working on, or is it a new code base for Stop Forum Spam?
For the API, yes. At the moment, the version 1 API is 13, 14 years old, and I've been adding things to that as people have been requesting them. But as with everything that grows organically, you wish you could go back and revisit it and rebuild it, but I just didn't have the time. So I thought API version 2, I'm just going to rebase the entire code. It's going to be JSON only instead of some of the more colorful serialization formats that API version 1 supports. I'm going to deprecate API version 1, but I'm never going to remove it. There are just too many people out there that rely on it in an old code base that's unsupported. And I think that would just be cruel of me. So version 2 is going to be entirely on Cloudflare Workers. People that are running version 1 need not worry about the API becoming unavailable. It's just not going to happen. It's going to remain there free for everyone to use for eternity. I'm looking at how API version 2 could use GraphQL, how we could personalize it more for a per user experience if there's functionality that we can put into the API, so that in the existing integrations with software that you can't edit, we could extend that. So people are bouncing ideas off it all the time. I'm chatting to people on the Stop Forum Spam site. We've got a great community there of people that volunteer their time as much as I volunteer my time to it. So it's all been a great experience. To think it's come a long way from how can I learn to code PHP and MySQL? I know, let's play around with this, to something that's serving 300,000 clients, the best part of 7 or 8 billion requests a year, and a terabyte of traffic a month. It's come a long way, and I want to see it grow even more.
That sounds pretty exciting. And also, I guess I've not heard anyone running GraphQL in a worker, in Cloudflare Worker or any sort of edge workers for that matter. So I'm really quite interested to see how that project pans out. But I guess I do want to ask you about this new version in terms of what's the sort of the rollout plan, because 300,000 clients, that's a huge number of people that have to upgrade to your new API. Do you have some idea in terms of how you're going to roll out this new version?
It's just going to be rolled out on a different endpoint, a different REST endpoint for the moment. Version 1's not going to change. The code base for version 1 isn't going to change. It's just going to use the Cloudflare workers routing to route the new API, the new version requests to a different worker. So the two will run completely independently of each other. And if you don't want to upgrade your API version 1, you won't have to. I'm not going to mandate that at all. I'm just hoping that version 2 is going to provide enough in the way of new features and interesting features that people go, that sounds like a really good thing. Let me just change the endpoint and use JSON. And if you don't want to use the new features, then I'm trying to make version 2 as backwards compatible as I can with version 1. So if you don't want the new features, you just ignore them in the serialized output. If you want to use GraphQL, I'm still playing with that. I had a friend tease me about implementing that, and I discounted it, but I can't help it. It's sitting in there in the back of my mind now, so I'll probably end up deploying a GraphQL version of the endpoint as well, just to keep him happy and stop him nagging me. But the code base is coming along slowly. I'm doing it on my spare time. The whole project's a hobby as such, and so I tinker around on the API code and the features in my spare time and in the weekends and the evenings. And so there is no real timescale. I certainly would want to have API version 2 deployed before the end of the year, or certainly available to people to test and provide not so much functional testing, but an integration testing, feedback about the features, testing the features, and seeing if they really work in the environments that most people are going to be using it in, which is protecting their forums, blogs from the scourge of criminal spam. It's not used exclusively in those. It's used by small companies to prevent fraud on their websites. You get these emails from small companies to say, we implemented your API in this way, and I'd never thought it'd be done that way. But they said, look, you've saved us hundreds of thousands of pounds in fraud every year. Thanks very much. It's things like that really want to make me keep doing this.
That's amazing. And also, I guess, good luck with the new version of your API. Sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun up ahead for you in terms of learning, but also just building stuff. How about in terms of the cost? Because you're volunteering your time, but also, like I said, you're paying for all of these things yourself as well. What's the cost looking like for Cloudflare workers so far?
Well, the whole costs are pretty good. LeaseWeb in the Netherlands provide me a server for free. And they have for several years now. And a big thank you to LeaseWeb, and particularly Leslie, who keeps it all running for me. Linode provided some VPS servers as well, and Cloudflare provided the workers as a part of their for the greater good project. So at the moment, it's serving 30 million requests a day, and on the costing model, that is about $25 a day. So if there was a financial backing and I had budget in order to work on whatever infrastructure I wanted, then Cloudflare Serverless is just brilliant. I don't see why anyone wouldn't run an API on it if they're running a business. As a project for the better good in my spare time, if Cloudflare hadn't stepped up and offered a service as they had, then it would still be running on VPS servers. I managed to get the code running on a $5 Linode VPS servers, and they were rock solid. So I could have had 5 of those running in Europe and the US, and just kept Redis. And so instead of $25 a day, it would have been $25 a month. But there were so many customers, or so many people using it, I had to provide more in the way of high availability and redundancy and fault tolerance, and Cloudflare Workers does it, so I'm using it.
Okay, very good to know, and really good of them to step up to the plate and help out the community by paying for the infrastructure for your project.
Oh, it's been phenomenal of them. I couldn't have done it without them.
All right, so I guess that's the end of all the questions I've had. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell the listeners before we go? Are there any personal projects that you want to mention?
This is pretty much it. I'm working on this in much of my spare time. and I'm hoping to get more into the serverless environment and the serverless community here in New Zealand. Unfortunately, COVID has kind of put a bit of a damper on that. I was shortlisted for a 10-minute lightning talk at the Serverless Auckland conference, which has since been cancelled or delayed to next year. So I'm hoping that playing around in Cloudflare Serverless will give me a bit more experience so I can go to that next year and provide a better knowledge to people who are interested in hearing about either the project or Cloudflare Serverless. They have a small market share, the giants of Azure with functions and Lambda and AWS and Google, but there are other serverless providers out there that provide just as good a service, and so the more I'm learning, the more I can compare. I want to have a look more at AWS Lambda, so I'm just naturally curious about it all. So it seems like a fantastic emerging technology, one that I'm interested in. So why not turn the personal interest into professional interest as well?
Excellent, and looking forward to when to COVID going away and being able to see your talk at the Serverless Days conference.
Well, it'll be online. I'll send you an invite.
Great, sounds good, perfect. And with that, thank you again for joining us today and sharing your story. And I hope you stay safe and hopefully see you sometime.
Well, I look forward to COVID being over and getting back to Europe to see tech and do tech and talk tech as well, because I spent many years there and have a great love for the place. It'd be good to get out there and see and talk to some familiar faces. So thank you.
Okay, bye-bye. Take care.
Thanks.
That's it for another episode of Real-World Serverless. To access the show notes and the transcript, please go to realworldserverless.com. And I'll see you guys next time.